Scary telling.
My heart was pounding in my chest as I heard the news of an active shooter at the local high school. I felt my stomach drop and my hands start to shake. I had to know if my son was okay. I rushed to the living room and turned on the TV. The news was on every channel, with reporters shouting over each other to get the latest details. I listened closely, hoping to hear any information about the safety of the students and faculty. But then I heard something that made my blood run cold. The reporters kept mentioning a name that was all too familiar to me. It was my son's name. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. How could my son be involved in something like this? I had raised him to be a good kid, to stay out of trouble and to treat others with kindness and respect. But now, it seemed like everything I thought I knew about him was being called into question. I tried calling him, but there was no answer. I felt a sense of panic rising in me as I thought about all the terrible things that could be happening. Was he hurt? Was he in danger? Was he somehow involved in the shooting? As I watched the news coverage, I saw the faces of parents and loved ones who were also waiting to hear about the safety of their children. They were crying and hugging each other, desperate for answers. I felt a sense of solidarity with them as we all waited in fear and uncertainty. The reporters were trying to gather as much information as possible, but their words were muddled and confusing. It was hard to get a clear picture of what was happening, and even harder to understand how my son could be involved. As the minutes turned into hours, I felt a sense of dread settling over me. The longer I went without hearing from my son, the more worried I became. I knew that I had to do something, to take action and find out what was going on. But for now, all I could do was watch and wait, hoping against hope that my son was safe and sound. I sat glued to the TV, trying to make sense of what was happening. The reporters were still shouting over each other, trying to get the latest scoop on the shooting. But all I could focus on was the fact that they seemed to know my son's name. I couldn't shake the feeling of confusion and disbelief. How could my son be connected to this horrible event? I tried to think back to any unusual behavior or signs of trouble, but I couldn't recall anything that would suggest he was capable of something like this. As the hours dragged on, I found myself becoming increasingly anxious. I tried calling my son's phone again, but it went straight to voicemail. I called his friends, his teachers, anyone who might have any information about what was going on. But no one seemed to know anything. I felt helpless and alone, with nothing but my fear and uncertainty to keep me company. Every time I heard a new detail on the news, my heart would skip a beat. Every time I thought about what might be happening to my son, I felt sick to my stomach. As the night wore on, I realized that I couldn't just sit and wait anymore. I had to do something. I had to go to the high school and try to find my son, to see if he was okay and get some answers. I got in my car and drove towards the school, my mind racing with a million terrible thoughts. What if he was hurt? What if he was in danger? What if he was the shooter? As I approached the school, I could see the flashing lights of emergency vehicles and the chaos of frightened students and parents. The police had cordoned off the area, and there were officers stationed at every entrance. I parked my car and started walking towards the school, my heart pounding in my chest. I saw other parents and loved ones doing the same, all of us desperate to find out what was happening. As I got closer, I could see the faces of the other parents, their eyes red and puffy from crying. We all looked at each other with a sense of solidarity, knowing that we were in this together. Finally, I made it to the school entrance. The police officer stopped me and asked me for my name and relation to any students inside. I told him my name and that my son was a student at the school. He asked for my son's name and I told him. He then told me that my son was in fact in the school and that all parents were instructed to wait outside the perimeter. My heart sank at the news, but I knew I had to be patient. I took a seat on the curb with the other parents and waited for any news. But as the hours ticked by, it became clear that there were still more questions than answers. I sat on the curb outside the high school, waiting anxiously for news about my son. I watched as other parents hugged their children tightly, tears streaming down their faces. I wanted nothing more than to do the same, to hold my son in my arms and know that he was safe. But the hours dragged on and there was still no word. The police had cordoned off the area around the school, and there was chaos and confusion everywhere. I could see students and teachers being escorted out of the building by police officers, some of them with injuries or tears in their eyes. I felt a sense of panic rising in me as I thought about what might be happening to my son. Was he hurt? Was he scared? Was he even still alive? I knew I had to do something, to take action and try to find him. I got from the curb and approached the police officers who were guarding the entrance. I told them that my son was a student at the school and that I was desperate to find him. They told me that it was still too dangerous to go inside, but that they would try to locate him and let me know if they had any information. But I couldn't just sit and wait. I knew that time was running out, and that every passing moment could mean the difference between life and death. So I decided to take matters into my own hands and try to find my son myself. I slipped through a gap in the fence and made my way towards the school. I could hear screams and cries coming from inside, but I blocked them out and focused on finding my son. I moved quickly, trying to stay out of sight and avoid the police officers who were patrolling the area. As I got closer to the school building, I saw a group of students huddled together near the entrance. I recognized my son's face among them and felt a rush of relief wash over me. But as I approached, I could see that he looked dazed and distant, as if he was in shock. "Dad," he said, as I reached him. "What are you doing here?" "I came to find you," I said, taking him in my arms. "Are you okay?" He nodded, but I could see that he was still in shock. I could feel his body shaking as I held him close. As we walked away from the school, I tried to ask him what had happened. But he seemed unable to speak, lost in his own thoughts and emotions. I knew that the coming days and weeks would be difficult, that we would need to work together to process what had happened and to find a way to move forward. But for now, all that mattered was that my son was safe and that we were together. After the shooting, my son and I were both in a state of shock. It was hard to believe that something like this had happened, and even harder to understand how my son could have been involved. But as the days went on, we started to get more information. We learned that the shooter was someone else entirely, and that my son had been caught up in the chaos and confusion of the event. Even though my son was innocent, we knew that his name would be forever associated with the tragedy. People in our community looked at us with suspicion and judgment, wondering how a good kid like my son could have been involved in something so terrible. We knew that we had to clear his name, to prove that he was not involved and to restore his reputation. It was a long and difficult process, but we were determined to see it through. We hired a lawyer who specialized in cases like these and started gathering evidence and witness testimony. We talked to teachers and other students who knew my son, trying to get a sense of his character and behavior leading up to the shooting. We discovered that there were a few students who had been spreading rumors about my son, saying that he had made threats or talked about the shooting in a way that suggested he might have been involved. But we were able to track down these students and prove that their claims were false. We also found security camera footage that showed my son in a completely different part of the school at the time of the shooting. The footage was grainy and hard to make out, but it was enough to convince the authorities that he was not involved. Slowly but surely, we started to see progress. The rumors and suspicions started to die down, and people began to realize that my son had been unfairly accused. It was a relief to see his name cleared, but we knew that the damage had already been done. In the aftermath of the shooting, my son and I had to deal with the emotional fallout. We talked to counselors and therapists, trying to process what had happened and find a way to move forward. It wasn't easy, but we were determined to do whatever it took to heal. Looking back on those dark days, I realized that we were lucky to have each other. We were able to support each other through the fear and uncertainty, and to fight together to clear my son's name. It was a difficult and painful journey, but we made it through, and we were stronger for it. Even after my son's name was cleared and the shooter was brought to justice, the fallout from the shooting continued to haunt us. It was a traumatic event that left a lasting impact on our lives and our community. We had to deal with the media attention that came with being associated with the shooting. Reporters would call our house, asking for interviews or information about what had happened. It was exhausting and invasive, and it felt like there was no escape from the constant scrutiny. We also had to deal with the judgment and suspicion of others in our community. Even though my son had been cleared of any wrongdoing, there were still people who looked at us with suspicion and skepticism. It was a difficult thing to bear, knowing that we were being judged for something that was completely out of our control. But the hardest part was dealing with our own emotions. The shooting had left a deep scar on both me and my son, and it was hard to find a way to heal. We went to therapy and talked to other survivors of similar events, but it felt like the trauma would never fully go away. There were nights when my son would wake up screaming, reliving the events of that day. There were days when I would wake up in a cold sweat, unable to shake the feeling of fear and dread. It was a constant reminder of how fragile life can be and how quickly everything can be taken away. But even in the midst of all the pain and uncertainty, there were moments of hope and healing. We found support in our friends and family who stood by us through the worst of it. We found strength in each other, knowing that we had been through something truly terrible and that we had survived. And in the end, we knew that the only way to move forward was to face our fears head-on, to embrace life and all its uncertainties. We couldn't let the shooting define us, couldn't let it control our lives. We had to find a way to live in a world where terrible things can happen, but where there is still hope and light and love. Looking back on it all, I realized that we were changed by the experience. We were forced to confront our own mortality, to face the reality that life can be fleeting and fragile. But we were also reminded of the resilience of the human spirit and the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. It was a painful and difficult journey, but we made it through, and we were forever changed by it.